This video is sponsored by ExpressVPN. H.G. Wells' influential 1897 sci-fi classic The Invisible Man toys with the notion of how each of us would perceive becoming invisible, more so figuratively than literally. Some of us wish to fade into obscurity and remain unnoticed to live our simple, peaceful, quiet lives, while for others, they may see it as the reverse effect, a way to feel in control and defy our limitations. The Invisible Man is effectively a cautionary tale about staying within our boundaries, how having power without consequence can and will bring out the worst in us, regardless of where our moral compass may lie. In the case of Wells' story, a former medical student called Griffin creates a formula for invisibility, but now seeks to reverse the effect, causing him to grow increasingly psychotic and violent, to the point he begins relishing in his curse as some sort of divine power he can use for his own interest. In many respects, it's a character study in the same vein as Frankenstein. It's a mad scientist consumed by a power only he can wield, naturally leading to more nefarious, selfish desires than for the purposes of the greater good. The story was given a fresh reinvention in 2020 by Lee Winnell, when he perfectly adapted The Invisible Man around the perspective of the victim, showing the power an abusive, manipulative, and violent presence can have on the psyche, even when they're not around. Simply put, what's more scary, being able to see the threat and adapt yourself around it, or just never knowing when and where it might be? However, there was another adaptation that came 20 years before that, while lacked the polish and nuance of the reimagining, made a noble effort to play into a distressingly psychosexual premise that, at the very least, deserves credit for its thematic aspirations. This was Hollow Man. Hollow Man tells the story of a narcissistic scientist called Sebastian Kane, who leads a top-secret team of scientists to engineer a serum for the military that turns its subjects invisible. However, after defying his weary boss's orders, Sebastian willingly volunteers as the first human test subject, knowing that the serum has drastic side effects as painfully proven on other animals, including the fact that the team have yet to discover how to reverse the effect. As a result, Sebastian ends up getting a literal taste of his own medicine, as during their efforts to make Sebastian visible again, he's subjected to the same restrictive conditions as the animals he inhumanely tested on, soon finding himself growing increasingly aggressive and vengeful of both his superiors and inferiors, eventually leading to violent consequences when he realizes the power he truly wields. It was basically a sexy modern twist on the man's arrogance trope that not only played into the hypnotic and tempting taste of power, but also made a modest commentary on real-world ethics, which was a topic close to the heart of director Paul Verhoeven. As we go along, please leave your thoughts in the comments below, including a recommendation for what I should cover next. And lastly, here are a few words from this video sponsor, ExpressVPN. There's nothing I hate more than being blocked from accessing videos and films on services like YouTube and Netflix because of my location. For example, I was excited to watch last week tonight's new episode on Law & Order, but since I'm in the UK, the video is unavailable in my country. In fact, it's completely hidden as though it doesn't exist. However, with ExpressVPN, I can simply open the app, select a US location from a drop-down list, and then after a quick refresh, I have unlimited access to all the videos outside my country as if I had opened the closet to Narnia. That's because ExpressVPN is designed to mask your device's IP address and make the internet think you're in a different country, thus bypassing restrictions set by service providers, websites, and even governments, giving you full, unrestricted control of your online entertainment. Imagine the devastation I would face if I could not access the divine masterpiece that is Morbius on Netflix US. It would be like going to my favorite Italian restaurant and being told I couldn't pick from the pasta dishes because I'm Irish. ExpressVPN is an absolute must-have for anyone who consumes as much content as I do, as it keeps your options fresh when you feel you've squeezed those services dry, giving you the value you deserve. With rave reviews, a 30-day money-back guarantee, and fast fast internet speeds to keep your streaming quality consistent, find out how you can get 3 months free by visiting expressvpn.com/Ryan. What's interesting about the film is that it's so easy to dismiss it as a gimmicky millennium sci-fi horror, but Hollow Man was remarkably ambitious for its time, and stayed faithful to the themes of H.G. Wells' original, thanks to Verhoeven's experience with dystopian sci-fi and morally ambiguous thrillers. If you're unfamiliar with Verhoeven's genuinely grim and gruesome take on science fiction, just watch RoboCop, Total Recall, and Starship Troopers, and then circle back here prepared for a surprisingly bloody outcome. On top of that, Verhoeven drew heavily from his previous 2 erotic films, Showgirls and Basic Instinct, suggested by biographer Daniel Keesey to be integral to Hollow Man's uncomfortable sense of voyeurism, given the story is predominantly framed from Sebastian's meal-gazing perspective. This view is also supported by actress Elisabeth Shue, who plays Sebastian's ex-girlfriend and colleague Linda, whom Sebastian persistently harasses now that she's dating another colleague called Matt, played by Josh Brolin, who frequently butts heads with Sebastian over the reversing formula. Shue wonderfully consolidated the film as a window into the seductive nature of evil, which you could argue is also proven by the fact that Kevin Bacon had a bit of a brooding rebel sex symbol vibe since Footloose, so his casting feels somewhat deliberate here to play against his usual character type, most noticeably his role in another sci-fi thriller called Flatliners. The point that's made, according to Keesey, is that Verhoeven saw the film's main moral contention as the audience's relationship with Sebastian as he spirals down a sexually violent rabbit hole. There's no getting past the fact that Sebastian is naturally the most interesting aspect of the story, as his invisibility ironically exposes his true character, and just how volatile, morally empty, and transparently unempathetic he truly is. I mean, it's one thing to be an arrogant dick who at least lives up to his own hype, as he is admittedly established as a brilliant scientist, but like with Walter White in Breaking Bad, to fuel that ego with greater and greater power isn't exactly going to humble a guy. Masculine insecurities be damned and all that. Before he goes invisible, you get the simple impression that he's just a smug, condescending prick who buys into his own hype and looks down on everyone around him. Then when he first goes invisible, he's cheeky with his colleagues and likes to play with them without much resistance or pushback from them, treating them as more like his play toys than respected peers. In fact, playing into man's arrogance, Sebastian is constantly shown to be indifferent to anything and anyone who doesn't further his own interests. He shows utter coldness to testing on animals, and while you might think his efforts to rekindle his relationship with his ex Linda imply some compassion and humanity, it's also equally implied the reason they broke up was because he was controlling, manipulative, and abusive. This is ultimately confirmed when he completely embraces his repulsive voyeuristic tendencies, as first warned to us by how he sleazily watches his vulnerable female neighbour who lives directly across from him. As the thrill of getting away with his actions intensify without consequence, he finally turns to assault towards his female colleagues and his neighbour, depressingly ending with an indulgence in murder. Again, for what might seem like your generic Hollywood sci-fi horror, Hollow Man's content was far more transgressive than you might expect. In fact, while it released R-rated in the US, here in the UK it released as a rare certificate 18, which is the equivalent of an NC-17. So make no mistake about it, Hollow Man was fully aware of its effort to push sensitive boundaries. This is why I enjoy Hollow Man as a striking contrast to Leigh Whannell's Adaptation, because while the latter is better made in my opinion, there's something so helpless about being trapped in the perpetrator's shoes. You become a shadow to his perverse, malevolent presence, an unwilling participant in his actions, and there is simply no escaping his control. However, before Sebastian goes total monster mode, his initial experience of the invisibility is unpleasant. It's small details like because his eyelids are now transparent means he perpetually sees, makes this whole process sound absolutely fucking horrifying. He's in actual agony, and it's all sold in the VFX body horror and Bacon's performance as he eventually lashes out at the team for their failure to turn him back. You could argue his condition figuratively becomes a punishment for what he did to the animals, but he never has the self-awareness to realize how unethical his actions are, later showing a double standard of not believing it to be fair that he should be treated like a lab rat because he's a dominant creature. The invisibility essentially becomes a symbol of how power corrupts. He already has a god complex and rejects being treated as inferior to his colleagues. He then starts to see his invisibility as a gift, one which he created and thus deserves absolute ownership to, and so his eventual motive is to remain invisible and wipe out all those who know about the experiments so he can stand apart from mere mortals and play the invisible man upstairs down on Earth in any way he wants. At the same time, he's still just flesh and bone like the rest of us, and this is where we get to the final showdown between him and his team as he traps them beneath the ground in the secret lab. So I guess the main issue I have with Hollow Man is that despite the provocativeness of its sci-fi and horror elements, it still struggles to figure out narratively what it wants to be, and ends with more of a shoulder-shrugging whimper than a bang. On the one end, you have this modern sexy twist on the mad scientist story, but then it sort of becomes an erotic domestic thriller involving a love triangle, and finally it just submits to being a basic slasher flick. It's not so much a bad thing because it is effective at being all those things, yet it leaves a lot of conflict around Sebastian underdeveloped or feeling incomplete. For one, the grand idea that Sebastian's research was automatically weaponized because it's funded by the Department of Justice sets up a potentially compelling moral dilemma of what power invisibility could bring on a global scale, but it's ultimately nothing more than a background detail. The only exploitation we see is on an intimate scale, but then again, if one can cause so much harm in such a short space of time, you can just imagine what the military would do with such a weapon. On the other end, we have the slasher climax, where Sebastian locks down the lab and kills each scientist one by one in an admittedly gruesome fashion, but it bothered me because the middle half's focus on Sebastian and his perversions was a far more terrifying concept than anything that happens in the lab. For as short-lived as this section is, the domestic thriller is when the film is at its very best. It's a gross portrayal of fearing something we cannot see. It's not only the invasion of our privacy, but the utter exposure and discomfort we all feel, even in our safest environments. It turns the body horror into something truly psychologically unnerving. A particular detail I love about Winnell's 2020 Invisible Man adaptation is that the horror comes from the presence of abuse, violence, and control that's latched itself permanently onto its victim that drives the story. And that's exactly what Verhoeven gets across, if indeed, like I said before, it's all from the perspective of the perpetrator. This slow burn portion of the movie is clearly what Verhoeven wanted to make for the entire runtime. It's just bookended by a mainstream Hollywood structure that he wanted to subvert. Hell, Verhoeven later disowned the film and it became his last Hollywood production, which I think speaks volumes for how he felt about his creative control. Although I think he's being a little harsh on himself because it's the script that prematurely brings us to the slasher climax and yet somehow still feels rushed that hurts the film overall. Scary Movie 2 got a real kick out of pretty much remaking this entire sequence, where the team split up with tranquilizer guns and heat sensor goggles to subdue Sebastian, with the real hilarious moment being when Linda fucks him up with a makeshift flamethrower. The film ends with Sebastian falling down an elevator shaft as the lab explodes after he rigged it to be destroyed so that only he knew the formula contained in his head, effectively burying himself with his own creation, so to speak. No, it's a perfectly serviceable ending, but I kinda think it missed the trick by not going down more of an ironic route. In my eyes, going back to the theme of arrogance and the god complex, Sebastian sees himself as above mere mortals, but he is ultimately just a man, so to me, it would have made more sense if they actually successfully took down Sebastian with a tranquilizer dart and he's permanently quarantined in a government prison. Of course, this is just my fanfic here, but the idea is that he's no more powerful than any of us, as something as innocuous as a sleeping dart was enough to take him down despite the sense of power and control he had, and the fact he despises being treated as a lab rat is made gratifying that he now has to spend the rest of his life as one. Either way, the film's ending aligns with H.G. Wells' story, which ends ironically with a man profiting off the story of the Invisible Man while trying to decipher his completely cryptic formula. Thus, the work dies with its creator. And that is basically Hollow Man. I am aware there was a direct-to-video sequel starring Christian Slater, but I have not seen it, so if you have, please let me know about it in the comments below, as well as you leaving your own thoughts on what I should cover next. And until next time, stay safe, stay away from invisibility, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye.